Hi, I'm James. On the day my father's will was read, my own mother and sister presented a letter they claimed he wrote, stating I was a disappointment unworthy of his legacy, and then they took everything. It's funny how the people who are supposed to love you the most can cut you the deepest. Have you ever been through something like this? Before I tell you about the cold, sterile law office where they handed me a check meant to erase me from our family's history, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when they finally realized I wasn't broken. I was just quiet. The main conflict began the moment my father, a decorated military officer, took his last breath. His absence created a vacuum in our sprawling McLean, Virginia home, and my mother, Linda, and older sister, Sarah, rushed to fill it with their own brand of cold ambition. I, at 26, suddenly became an inconvenience, a loose thread in the perfect narrative they were weaving. They moved through the house like ghosts with a purpose, their whispers in the hallways becoming the new soundtrack of my life. The conversations would stop the second I entered a room. The air grew thick with unspoken plans, and I felt like a stranger in the very place where I took my first steps. My presence merely tolerated until they could figure out how to dispose of me for good. The weeks after the funeral were a masterclass in psychological warfare. My mother would look at me with this profound pity, a look she perfected for her socialite friends, as if I were a tragic art piece she had to display. "James is just lost without his father," she'd say, her voice dripping with false concern. Sarah was more direct. She started making decisions about Dad's estate as if I didn't exist. One afternoon, I came home to find an empty space in the garage where his prized 1967 Ford Mustang used to be. When I confronted her, she just shrugged, her eyes as cold as steel. "It's being taken care of, James. Don't worry your head about it." They were systematically erasing every trace of my connection to him, one memory at a time, and they were doing it right in front of my face. The day of the will reading felt like a final sentencing. We sat in the ridiculously expensive conference room of the family's law firm, a place that reeked of old money and sealed fates. The mahogany table was so polished, I could see my own distorted reflection, a pale, tense face staring back at me. My mother and sister were dressed in somber, elegant black, looking every bit the grieving widow and daughter, but their eyes held a glint of victory. The lawyer, a man who had known me since I was a child, couldn't even look at me. He just cleared his throat and began reading a document that felt like a work of complete fiction, a story where my father, the man who taught me about honor and integrity, had decided I was nothing. The words of the fraudulent will were like a series of calculated blows. It painted a picture of me as a failure, a son who had strayed from the path of excellence my father had supposedly laid out. It praised Sarah for her business acumen and unwavering loyalty, positioning her as the sole and worthy heir to the family's considerable investment portfolio and the McLean estate. Every sentence was a carefully crafted insult, designed not just to disinherit me, but to annihilate my sense of self-worth. I sat there, stone-faced, listening to this character assassination, feeling the blood drain from my face. I could feel my mother's and sister's eyes on me, waiting for me to break, to scream, to give them the dramatic scene they craved. But I gave them nothing. The lawyer finished reading, the silence in the room deafening. Then Sarah slid a thin, crisp envelope across the polished table. It stopped right in front of me. "Dad wanted you to have this," she said, her voice a carefully rehearsed blend of sorrow and condescension. "He didn't want you to be left with absolutely nothing." Inside was a check for $10,000, a sum so insultingly small compared to the millions at stake that it was clearly meant as a final slap in the face. It was hush money, go-away money, a price tag they had put on my silence and my departure from their lives. Taking it would be an admission of everything they claimed I was. Beside the check was a letter, supposedly written and signed by my father. I didn't need to be a handwriting expert to know it was a forgery. The words were cruel, filled with a bitterness that was completely alien to the man I knew. It spoke of my lack of direction and my failure to live up to the family name. It was a perfect, venomous script, designed to sever the last emotional tie I had to my father's memory. This was their masterstroke. They weren't just stealing an inheritance, they were trying to steal my past, to poison my relationship with the one person in that family who had ever truly seen me. They wanted to make me believe that my own father had rejected me, ensuring I would be too broken to ever fight back. I remember my fingers feeling numb as I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope with the check. I stood up, the legs of the heavy chair scraping against the floor. I looked at my mother, then at my sister. Their faces were masks of feigned sympathy, but I could see the triumph flickering in their eyes. They thought they had won. They saw my silence, my calm demeanor, as weakness, as acceptance of my fate. They believed I was the lost, directionless boy they had described in their fabricated will. They couldn't possibly comprehend the cold, hard resolve that was crystallizing in my gut. This was no longer about a house or a stock portfolio. This was about my father's honor. As I walked out of that office and into the cold city air, I didn't feel defeated. I felt focused. The pain was there. A sharp, deep burning thing in my chest, but underneath it something else was being forged. A quiet determination. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my grief for weakness and my silence for surrender. They had no idea that my father, a man who lived his life 10 steps ahead of everyone else, had prepared me for this exact moment of betrayal. I remembered his words from our last conversation, a quiet talk we had on the back porch a month before he died. He had looked at me with an intensity I'll never forget, and spoken of hidden truths and the true meaning of legacy. And I remembered the small, heavy metal box he had given me, a box I was told to never open unless they tried to destroy who he was. I drove away from that law firm in a daze, the city of Arlington blurring past my windshield like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The envelope with the check and the letter sat on the passenger seat, a $10,000 insult and a page of lies. It felt heavier than a stack of bricks. I didn't have a destination. I just drove, the engine of my modest sedan, a low hum against the roaring in my ears. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by something colder and harder. It was a feeling of profound isolation, like I was the last person on earth. My mother and sister hadn't just disinherited me, they had performed an amputation, cutting me out of the family's body with surgical precision, and they expected me to just bleed out quietly and disappear. On some numb autopilot, I ended up back in McLean, on the street I had lived on my entire life. I pulled into the long, curved driveway of our family home, the place where every significant memory I had was made. I walked up the familiar stone path to the front door and put my key in the lock. It didn't turn. I tried again, jiggling it, my heart starting to pound in my chest. It was no use. They had changed the locks. I stood there on the porch, a trespasser at my own front door, looking at the warm lights glowing through the windows. I could almost hear their laughter inside, a toast to their victory with my father's expensive scotch. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from my chest to my face. I was officially, unequivocally, locked out of my own life. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice smooth and unaffected, as if she were taking a call from her tailor. "James? Is something wrong?" I kept my own voice as level as I could. "The key doesn't work, Sarah. I can't get in." There was a brief pause, a silence that was more insulting than any word she could have said. "Oh, that. Mom and I decided it was best to upgrade the security system. For our safety," she said, the emphasis on our, making it perfectly clear I was no longer part of that equation. "We'll arrange a time for you to come by and get your personal belongings. Just call my assistant to schedule it." She was treating me like a disgruntled former employee, not her brother. Then she hung up. Standing there in the cold, I was suddenly hit with a memory so vivid it almost knocked me over. I was 16, and Dad was teaching me how to parallel park his old Mustang in this very driveway. I kept messing it up, getting frustrated, and he just laughed. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "It's not about getting it perfect on the first try, son. It's about not giving up until you get it right." His voice in my memory was so clear, so kind. It was the voice of the real man, not the cold, cruel stranger from that forged letter. That memory became an anchor in the storm of my anger and grief. They could take the house, the money, the cars, but they couldn't take that. They couldn't touch the truth of who he was. And in that moment, I knew I wouldn't give up until I got it right. That night, I checked into a generic motel off the highway, a place with peeling paint and the lingering smell of stale smoke and bleach. The contrast was sickening. I had woken up that morning in a 4-poster bed in a historic Virginia home, and I was going to sleep in a room where the Gideon's Bible was the most valuable object. This was my new reality, a life defined by a $10,000 check. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress and stared at the metal box my father had given me, which I'd retrieved from the trunk of my car. It was a simple, grey, military-style footlocker, heavy and locked. It felt cold to the touch. It held the last piece of my father I had left, the last instruction he had ever given me, a final contingency from a man who always planned for the worst. His words echoed in my head, as clear as the day he spoke them. Only open this if they try to destroy who I was. It wasn't if they try to steal from you or if they hurt you. It was specifically about his identity, his honor. He knew. Somehow, he must have known what my mother and sister were capable of. He had seen the greed festering beneath the surface of our picture-perfect family. He didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a mission. He had armed me, not with lawyers and legal challenges, but with something far more powerful, the truth, locked away in this cold metal box. The weight of that responsibility was immense, but it was also clarifying. My purpose was no longer lost in the fog of grief. Every instinct screamed at me to find a crowbar and pry the box open right then and there. I needed to know what was inside. I needed the answer, the weapon, the vindication, but I stopped myself. My father was a master strategist. He never made a move without thinking through every possible consequence. Opening this box prematurely could be a fatal mistake. I had to assume my mother and sister were watching me, waiting for me to make a foolish move. They expected me to be emotional, irrational, and broken. I had to be the opposite. I had to be patient. I had to be disciplined. I had to be my father's son, in a way they could never comprehend. The injustice burned, but I had to let it simmer, turning it into fuel for a fight that had to be won with intelligence, not just anger. A few days later, the next wave of their attack came, this time in a more public and insidious form. I was scrolling through a local society blog when I saw it, a photo of Linda and Sarah at a high-profile charity auction, both smiling graciously for the camera. They were dressed in designer black, the perfect image of bereaved elegance. The caption was nauseating. It praised them for their strength in the face of tragedy and lauded Sarah for ably stepping into her father's shoes to oversee the family's considerable philanthropic legacy. They weren't just erasing me. They were actively building a new narrative for public consumption, one where they were the noble guardians of my father's name, and I was, at best, a footnote, and at worst, a shameful secret they had to manage. The proof that their campaign was working came a week later. I was at a small diner trying to make a coffee last for an hour when a man I vaguely recognized approached my table. It was Colonel Thompson, an old friend of my father's. He offered his condolences, his expression a mixture of pity and awkwardness. "Tough times, son," he said, patting my shoulder. "I heard from your mother. You're finding your own way now. Your father, he always wanted you to stand on your own 2 feet." The words were meant to be kind, but they were coated in my mother's poison. They had been laying this groundwork for months, painting me as the prodigal son, the drifter, so that when they finally cut me off, it would look like an act of tough love, not a calculated theft. The financial reality of my situation began to set in with brutal efficiency. The $10,000, which had seemed like such an insult, now felt like a lifeline and a curse. I had to cash the check. Walking into the bank, I felt a deep sense of shame. Handing over that piece of paper felt like accepting their terms, like agreeing that this was my price. The teller processed the transaction without a second glance, but to me it was a moment of profound surrender. This money was now the only thing keeping me from being completely destitute. It was the cost of my temporary survival, bought with my silence and my dignity. Every dollar I spent was a reminder of their victory and my exile, a constant, nagging whisper that I was worthless. That night, back in the motel room that had become my entire world, I looked from the dwindling stack of cash on the nightstand to the unyielding metal box beside it. The injustice was no longer just an emotional wound. It was a practical, suffocating reality. They had taken my home, my inheritance, and my father's memory. They had tried to strip me of my name and my worth. But as I stared at that box, I felt a shift inside me. The fear and humiliation were still there, but they were being eclipsed by a cold, clear resolve. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one. They thought they had buried me, but they had only planted a seed. and I would not let them decide what grew from it. For the next 2 weeks, my life shrunk to the four walls of that motel room. The $10,000 was a ticking clock, each meal, each night's stay, a grain of sand falling through the hourglass. I spent my days in a haze of cheap coffee and the low hum of the faulty air conditioner, the metal box sitting on the second bed like a silent roommate. The initial rage had cooled into a low, steady burn of purpose. I couldn't just sit here and wait for the money to run out. They expected me to fade away, to become the ghost they told everyone I was. But my father didn't raise a ghost. He raised a soldier, even if I never wore the uniform. It was time to stop being a victim and start gathering intelligence. I had to understand not just what they did, but why. The sheer scale of their betrayal felt too elaborate for simple greed. My first battlefield was the motel's painfully slow public Wi-Fi. Huddled over my aging laptop, I started digging. I wasn't a lawyer or a private investigator, but I was my father's son, and he had taught me to be meticulous, to look for patterns where others saw chaos. I started with public records, corporate filings, property deeds, anything connected to my family's name. I spent hours sifting through digital archives, my eyes burning from the screen's glare. It felt like trying to map an ocean with a teaspoon. I saw Sarah's name appear as the new director of my father's primary holding company, a move that was executed with chilling speed just days after his death. Everything on the surface looked clean, professional, and utterly impenetrable. It was a perfectly constructed fortress designed to keep me and anyone else out. Then, after days of hitting digital brick walls, I found a crack. It wasn't in the main corporate structure, but in the charitable foundation my mother controlled. On the foundation's public donor list, I found a series of large donations made over the past year to several newly formed LLCs. These companies had generic, meaningless names like Patriot Consulting Group and Liberty Strategic Solutions. They sounded official, important even, but when I cross-referenced their registration details, I found they were all shell corporations, registered to the same anonymous P.O. Ibox in Delaware. Money was being funneled from my father's estate, through the foundation and into these ghost companies. This wasn't just hiding assets from me. This was a sophisticated system for moving vast sums of money off the books, making it disappear. The discovery sent a jolt of ice through my veins and triggered a memory I had long since filed away. It was from about 6 months before my father died. I had walked into his home office late one night to find him staring at a wall of financial charts, his face etched with a kind of deep, weary anxiety I had never seen on him before. He looked older, smaller, almost haunted. When I asked if everything was all right, he just shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the papers. "Some things, son," he had said, his voice low and gravelly, "are more complicated than they appear. Honor is a heavy thing to carry, especially when others try to use yours as a shield." At the time, I thought he was just talking about the pressures of his career. Now, his words felt like a warning, a piece of a puzzle I was just beginning to understand. I knew I had reached the limit of what I could uncover on my own. I needed help, not from a lawyer, I couldn't afford one, and I couldn't trust one from my family's world. I needed someone who knew my father's world, the real one, beyond the country clubs and charity galas. My mind immediately went to General Miller, a man who had served with my father for over 30 years. They were more than colleagues. They were brothers in arms. But calling him was a huge risk. He was a pillar of their community. For all I knew, he was at my mother's side, believing the same lies she was telling everyone else. If he reported my call back to her, I would lose any element of surprise I had. But it was the only move I had left. My father trusted him, and right now that was all I had to go on. My hand was shaking slightly as I dialed his number, the one I found in an old address book of my father's. I half expected his assistant to answer, but he picked up himself, his voice as firm and commanding as I remembered. I kept my own voice calm, measured. I didn't mention the will or the inheritance. I simply said I was at a crossroads and could use the advice of someone my father respected. I asked if he might have time for a coffee. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched for an eternity. I could hear him weighing the request, considering the implications. "There's a diner off Route 1 in Alexandria," he finally said. "The Bell Haven, tomorrow, 0800. Come alone. The military precision of his instructions gave me a sliver of hope. He was agreeing to a clandestine meeting, away from prying eyes. The diner was a relic from another era, all chrome and cracked red vinyl, smelling of bacon and stale coffee. General Miller was already there, sitting in a booth in the back corner, nursing a black coffee. He looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than I recalled. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He just motioned for me to sit and watched me with piercing eyes as I ordered. I laid it out for him, not as an accusation against my family, but as a son's concern. I told him about my father's stress, the late nights in his office, the strange comment about honor being used as a shield. I told him I felt that my father's legacy was being misrepresented, twisted into something it wasn't. I watched his face for any sign of dismissal, any hint that he thought I was just a bitter, disinherited son. He listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving mine. When I finished, he slowly stirred his coffee, the clinking of the spoon against the ceramic mug, the only sound between us. He seemed to be debating something internally. Finally, he put the spoon down and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Your father was a patriot, James, one of the finest men I ever served with. But he was in a bind, a serious one. He paused, taking a deep breath. There was an internal review underway at the Pentagon before he passed. Unofficial, very quiet. It was about some of his private financial dealings, specifically investments linked to overseas contractors. His security clearance was under review. He was convinced someone was using his name, his reputation, as cover for a massive money laundering scheme. He was trying to untangle it without bringing shame on the uniform. The words hit me with the force of a physical impact, knocking the air from my lungs. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The fraudulent will, the character assassination, selling off his assets, locking me out. It wasn't just about stealing an inheritance. It was a hostile takeover of his entire life, his legacy. They needed to control the narrative completely. They needed to paint him as a flawed man, and me as an unreliable outcast to ensure that if this investigation ever went public, they would be in control of the story. And, more importantly, the money. They weren't just being greedy. They were covering up a crime that was far more serious than simple fraud. They were committing treason against his memory and everything he stood for. I drove back to the motel in a stupor, the general's words echoing in my head. The sterile, lonely room no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a bunker. The world outside, with its traffic and noise, seemed distant and unreal. My family's cruelty now had a context, a motive that was colder and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. They weren't just trying to destroy me. They were trying to obliterate my father's honor to save themselves. The metal box on the bed seemed to hum with a new energy. My father's instruction, only open this if they try to destroy who I was no longer a cryptic warning. It was a direct order. They weren't just tarnishing his name in society columns. They were trying to frame a dead hero to cover up a federal crime. My fight was no longer just about family injustice. It was about defending my father's legacy from the people who should have been its staunchest guardians. I walked over to the box and placed my hand on the cold, unforgiving lock. It was time to go to war. With General Miller's words still ringing in my ears, I drove back to the motel, the world outside my windshield feeling muted and distant. The key to the footlocker was in my pocket, a simple, cold piece of metal that now felt like the pin of a grenade. My father hadn't left me a puzzle. He had left me a battlefield command. The instruction, only open this if they try to destroy who I was no longer a piece of advice. It was my rules of engagement. I walked into the stale, bleach-scented air of my room and stood over the grey metal box. It sat on the cheap floral bedspread, an object of immense power in a place of complete insignificance. My hands weren't shaking anymore. A strange, cold calm had settled over me. This was it. This was the moment my father had prepared me for, the last duty he would ever ask of me. I pulled out the key, its teeth catching the dim light from the single lamp, and prepared to unlock the truth. The lock was stiff, rusted slightly at the edges from years of sitting in storage. It took a surprising amount of force to get the key to turn, the metallic groan echoing loudly in the silent room. It was a physical struggle that felt deeply symbolic, as if I were fighting against years of secrets and decay. Finally, with a sharp, definitive click, the latch gave way. I lifted the heavy lid, and a wave of air from the past washed over me. It was the scent of my father's study, old paper, leather, and a faint, lingering trace of his pipe tobacco. It was a smell I hadn't realized I'd missed so much, and it hit me with a force that almost brought me to my knees. Inside it there was no treasure, no hidden cash. It was just an organized collection of manila folders, a small black USB flash drive, and a single, thick envelope sealed with wax, bearing my name in my father's unmistakable, precise handwriting. I spent the next several hours under the weak glow of the motel desk lamp, piecing together the last year of my father's life. The folders were filled with financial documents, offshore bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and incorporation papers for the same shell companies I had discovered online. But these weren't his records. They were copies he had secretly made. He had been tracking the money flowing out of the family foundation, meticulously documenting how my mother was using his name and his network of contacts as a shield for a massive money laundering operation. He had mapped out the entire criminal enterprise, from the source of the funds to their final destination. He wasn't the target of the investigation. He was the primary investigator, a lonely soldier fighting a secret war from inside his own home. Then, I opened the sealed envelope. Inside was the real letter my father had meant for me to read. The words on the page were not those of a disappointed father, but of a man trapped in an impossible situation, his heart heavy with regret. He explained everything. He had discovered Linda's activities a year ago, how she had become entangled with some very dangerous international players who saw his sterling military reputation as the perfect cover. He couldn't go to the authorities without triggering a scandal that would tarnish the uniform he loved and put me in direct danger. So he devised a desperate plan. The fraudulent will, the disinheritance. It was all a firewall. He had to cut me off, make me an outcast to ensure I was completely clear of the legal and criminal fallout he knew was coming. He wasn't pushing me away. He was placing me in a lifeboat while he went down with the ship. My hands trembled as I picked up the USB drive and plugged it into my laptop. It contained only a handful of audio files, labeled by date. I clicked on the most recent one. My father's voice filled the room, weary but firm. It was a recording of him confronting my mother. Her reply was not defensive or scared, but chillingly pragmatic. "Oh, Richard, don't be so naive," she said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "This is how the world works. This is how we afford this life you pretend to be above. Your honor doesn't pay for the house in McLean or the galas in D.C. This does." Hearing her admit to it all, hearing her mock the very principles he lived and died for, was like listening to a monster confess. There was no remorse, no conflict, only the cold, hard logic of a woman who saw honor as a commodity to be exploited. Now I understood the full, horrifying scope of their plan: the forged will, the public character assassination, the $10,000 check. It was all a calculated strategy to neutralize me. If I ever discovered the truth, who would believe me? I was the lazy, directionless son, the family disappointment. My word would mean nothing against the carefully crafted image of the grieving widow and the dutiful daughter. They weren't just stealing an inheritance, they were preemptively destroying my credibility to protect their criminal empire. The weight of the evidence on my desk felt immense. I had everything I needed to vindicate my father and expose them, but this was bigger than a family dispute. This was about national security, military corruption. One wrong move, and this whole thing could be buried forever. I picked up the phone and called General Miller. My voice was different this time, devoid of the uncertainty it held before. There was no tremor, only the flat, steady tone of a man with a singular purpose. "General," I said, keeping my words brief and precise, "it's James. I have it. Everything you suspected, and more. Documents, offshore account records, and audio recordings." My father documented it all. I could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. He also left a sealed affidavit. The general's response was immediate and commanding. "Son, listen to me very carefully. Do not move from that location. Do not talk to anyone else. I am handling this from my end. Where are you exactly?" I gave him the address of the cheap motel that had become my headquarters. The general laid out the plan. It was simple, high stakes, and had to be executed with military precision. The final probate court hearing to ratify the will was scheduled in 2 days. This was our only shot. Once the judge's gavel fell and the estate was officially transferred to Sarah and Linda, they would have the legal power to shred, delete, and bury every piece of evidence forever. The general's instructions were clear. I was to attend the hearing. I was to remain silent until the very last moment, just as the judge was preparing to issue his final ruling. At that point, I was to approach the bench and hand him one thing and one thing only, my father's sealed affidavit. He told me that other forces would be in place, ready to act on that signal. The next 48 hours would be the longest of my life. On the morning of the hearing, I got dressed with a sense of solemn duty. I didn't put on an expensive suit to try and match theirs. I wore a simple dark navy suit I'd owned for years, clean, pressed, and unremarkable. It was the uniform of a man there to do a job, not to make a statement. I placed the thick, sealed envelope containing my father's affidavit into the inside pocket of my jacket. Its weight was a constant, physical reminder of the promise I was about to keep. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror above the motel room's dresser. The lost, grieving young man who had checked in weeks ago was gone. In his place was someone I barely recognized, someone with his father's eyes, filled with a resolve that was as hard and cold as forged steel. I arrived at the Arlington County Courthouse and took a seat on a wooden bench at the very back of the courtroom. The air was thick with the sterile formality of law and procedure. Across the room, I saw them. My mother and sister were seated at the plaintiff's table, flanked by a team of expensive-looking lawyers. They looked poised, confident, and completely at ease. Sarah caught my eye for a brief moment, her expression a mix of annoyance and contempt, as if my very presence was a final inconvenience she had to endure before claiming her prize. They had no idea. They saw me sitting alone in the back, a pathetic footnote to their victory. They couldn't hear the clock ticking down the final seconds of the world they had built on a foundation of lies and betrayal. I just sat there, my hand resting over the affidavit in my pocket, and waited for my signal. The judge, a man with a tired face and graying temples, shuffled the papers in front of him. His voice droned on, a monotone recitation of legal jargon that was about to finalize the theft of my father's life. Having reviewed the last will and testament of Colonel Richard Sterling, he began, looking over his spectacles at my mother and sister, and hearing no objections, this court is prepared to ratify the document and execute the transfer of the estate to... He paused, looking down at the page. My mother, Linda, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to her lawyer, a gesture of finality. Sarah sat beside her, a portrait of serene victory, her posture perfect, her expression a mask of somber duty. They believed they were moments away from possessing everything. They had no idea that everything they were about to inherit was a liability, not an asset. They were claiming ownership of a crime scene. The judge cleared his throat, ready to deliver the final blow. To the primary beneficiary, his daughter, Sarah Sterling, he lifted his gavel slightly, the polished wood catching the fluorescent light. This was it. This was the moment General Miller had described, the point of no return. The lawyer for my family stood up, a smug, satisfied smile playing on his lips. The family has no objections, Your Honor. We are ready to conclude this matter. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. I could feel the weight of my father's affidavit in my jacket pocket, a dense square of paper that felt heavier than a block of lead. It was more than a document. It was a promise, a final order from a commanding officer to his son. My heart wasn't pounding with fear, but with a strange, cold clarity. The time for silence was over. With a slow, deliberate movement, I stood up. The legs of my wooden chair scraped against the polished floor, the sound unnaturally loud, a sharp and ugly tear in the fabric of the courtroom's decorum. Every head in the room turned towards me. My mother's face tightened, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fury and embarrassment. Sarah shot me a look of pure venom, her perfect composure finally cracking. How dare I interrupt their coronation? The judge peered down at me from his elevated bench, his expression one of weary impatience. He saw a disgruntled son, a loose end making a final, pathetic scene. He had no idea he was looking at the executor of a different kind of will, one that dealt not in assets and property, but in truth and consequences. He was about to become an unwilling participant in the detonation of a carefully buried landmine. I started the long walk from the back of the courtroom toward the bench. Each step echoed on the marble floor, a steady, rhythmic beat counting down the final seconds of my family's fabricated world. I didn't look at my mother or sister. I didn't acknowledge the whispers that erupted in my wake. My entire focus was on the judge, on the man holding the gavel that could either legitimize a lie or uphold the truth. The air grew thick with tension. Their lawyer was already on his feet, preparing to object, to have me removed, to silence me one last time. But I kept walking, my gaze locked on the bench. I was no longer an invisible son or a family disappointment. I was a messenger, and I was about to deliver a message from a man they had all profoundly underestimated, most of all the two women who shared his name. I stopped directly in front of the judge's bench, the dark, imposing wood a barrier between the law and the truth. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke in a calm, measured tone that carried easily through the now silent room. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, "my apologies for the interruption. Before you conclude, I have one final document to submit for the court's consideration. It is on behalf of my father, Colonel Richard Sterling." I reached into my jacket, pulled out the thick, sealed envelope, and placed it gently on the polished surface of the bench. The wax seal bearing my father's signet ring was intact. It was a final piece of correspondence from a man who knew his words would one day be needed, a ghost reaching out from the grave to have the last say in his own story. Their lawyer practically lunged forward. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an outrageous and desperate stunt. The petitioner has had weeks to contest the will. This is a baseless attempt to disrupt these proceedings." He was loud, indignant, playing his part perfectly. The judge looked from the lawyer to me, then down at the envelope. For a moment, I saw the dismissal in his eyes. He was about to agree, to have the bailiff escort me out. But he paused. Maybe it was the military precision of the seal. Maybe it was the gravity in my voice. Or maybe it was just a flicker of judicial curiosity. He held up a hand to silence the lawyer. "I'll decide what's baseless," he said, his voice sharp. He picked up the envelope, his fingers testing its weight. The fate of everyone in that room rested in his hands. He broke the wax seal with his thumb, the small cracking sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. He unfolded the pages within and began to read. I watched his face, the only thing that mattered in the entire world right now. The first change was subtle, a slight furrowing of his brow as he processed the opening lines. Then his eyes widened, his professional mask of impartiality slipping away. The color began to drain from his face, leaving it a sickly, pale gray. He gripped the edges of the affidavit, his knuckles turning white. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. He wasn't reading a legal challenge. He was reading a national security briefing. He was reading the confession of a patriot who had been forced to document the treason being committed under his own roof, by his own wife. After what felt like an eternity, the judge slowly looked up. His eyes were wide with a kind of controlled horror. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at me. His gaze settled directly on my mother and sister, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in their eyes. They didn't know what was in the letter, but they could see its effect. The judge's voice, when he finally spoke, was low, tight, and stripped of all judicial pleasantries. It was the voice of a man who had just seen something that had shaken him to his core. He turned to the bailiff standing by the door. "Deputy," he commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "seal this courtroom now. No one enters, no one leaves, all cell phones off. This is now a matter of federal security." The finality of his order sent a shockwave through the room. My mother's carefully constructed composure shattered. She turned to Sarah, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Sarah was frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning terror. Their lawyer was stammering, trying to object. But the judge cut him off with a single cold glare. The bailiff moved with swift efficiency, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom closing with a deep, resonant thud that signaled the end of everything. They were trapped. The world they had so carefully controlled, the narrative they had so masterfully written, had just been erased. The room, which moments ago had been the stage for their greatest triumph, had just become their prison. A few seconds of suffocating silence passed, the air thick with unspoken panic. Then, a side door near the judge's bench, one I hadn't even noticed before, opened without a sound. Two men stepped through. They were not courthouse security. They were dressed in the immaculate, imposing dark blue uniforms of the Military Police Criminal Investigation Division. Their movements were quiet, efficient, and utterly devoid of emotion. They positioned themselves on either side of the judge's bench, their presence transforming the probate hearing into something else entirely. They weren't here to discuss wills or estates. They were here to secure a threat. The courtroom was no longer a civil chamber. It was an active crime scene, and the two prime suspects were sitting at the plaintiff's table. I finally allowed myself to look directly at my mother and sister. The blood had drained from their faces, the smug confidence, the condescending pity, the cold ambition. It was all gone, replaced by the raw, primal terror of being caught. Sarah stared at the military officers, her mind finally connecting the dots. Linda's hands were trembling so violently she had to clench them in her lap. In that moment, they understood. The fortune they had schemed for, the sprawling McLean estate, the vintage cars, the investment portfolio. It was no longer a prize to be won. It was evidence. It was the paper trail of their betrayal, not just of a son but of a country. I hadn't come to court to fight for my inheritance. I had come to deliver my father's final report, and as I stood there, watching their empire crumble into dust, I felt not triumph, but a profound quiet peace. His honor was finally safe. I was escorted from the courtroom through a separate door, away from the chaos that erupted behind me. A quiet, stone-faced MP led me down a sterile hallway, his hand resting lightly on my back. Not as if I were a suspect, but like I was a fragile piece of evidence that needed to be secured. I didn't look back. I could hear my mother's voice, a sharp, panicked shriek that was entirely stripped of her usual calculated grace. It was the sound of a queen realizing her castle was made of sand. I was led into a small, windowless room where General Miller was waiting. He looked at me, not with pity, but with a profound respect that felt heavier and more valuable than any inheritance. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a mission completed. The weight of the last few weeks, the fear and the anger, finally began to lift, replaced by a deep, bone-weary sense of relief. The war was over. His honor was secure. The next few hours were a blur of formal debriefings in a secure room at Fort McNair that felt a world away from the Arlington courthouse. I handed over the metal box and everything it contained, the USB drive with the audio files, the folders of financial documents, and my father's real letter to me. A team of federal investigators listened intently as I recounted everything, from the day of the will reading to my meeting with General Miller. They treated me with a quiet professionalism that was both unnerving and validating. It was clear this was no longer a family drama. This was a significant breach of national security. They explained that my father's disinheritance was the only legal way he could ensure I was firewalled from the criminal conspiracy, making me a clean witness and the untainted executor of his evidence. He hadn't abandoned me. He had deployed me. In the days that followed, the story broke, but not in the sensational way I had expected. The news reports were vague, citing a sensitive federal investigation into the financial dealings of a prominent D.C. family. The sprawling McLean estate, the symbol of my family's power, was sealed off with yellow federal tape, its grand facade now looking like a mausoleum for their ambition. I was placed in a form of voluntary protective custody, living in a nondescript furnished apartment in a city I didn't recognize. The isolation was absolute, but it felt different from the loneliness of the motel room. That had been a prison of their making. This was a sanctuary. For the first time in months, I could sleep without the gnawing fear that I was a ghost. I was no longer an outcast. I was a key witness, protected by the very system my father had dedicated his life to serving. The legal machine ground on with terrifying efficiency. The charges against Linda and Sarah were extensive and severe. Conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and most damningly, violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Their team of high-priced corporate lawyers, so smug and confident in probate court, were completely out of their depth against the power of the Department of Justice. My father's evidence was a fortress. Every document, every recorded conversation was a stone they couldn't move. The entire sterling fortune, the millions in stocks, the properties, the art, the luxury cars. All of it was frozen. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, it was all considered the proceeds of a criminal enterprise. They had schemed and betrayed and destroyed our family for a fortune that now belonged entirely to the U.S. Treasury. I attended their sentencing, sitting in the back of a federal courtroom just as I had before, but this time the room felt different. It was heavy with the weight of real justice. Linda and Sarah were unrecognizable, dressed in standard-issue jumpsuits. Stripped of their designer clothes and their air of superiority, they looked small and broken. The judge handed down their sentences, 15 years for my mother, 12 for Sarah, with no possibility of parole. As they were led away, Sarah's eyes met mine for a fleeting second. There was no hatred left in them, no anger. There was just a vast, empty confusion, the look of someone who had gambled everything on a lie and couldn't comprehend why she had lost. I felt no joy, no satisfaction in their downfall. I just felt a profound, aching sadness for the family we could have been, and a quiet finality, like closing a heavy book for the last time. My new life began with nothing. The government offered me assistance through the Witness Protection Program, a new name, a new city. I turned it down. I didn't want to hide. My name was James Sterling, and for the first time I felt I could carry it with the honor it deserved. I moved to a small town in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place where no one knew my story. I got a job at a local cabinet maker's workshop, learning to work with my hands, to build things that were solid and true. I remember the feeling of my first paycheck, a few $100s for a week of honest, hard labor, holding that worn, crumpled cash in my hand. I felt a sense of pride that the $10,000 check of hush money could never buy. It was mine. I had earned it. I was building a life, one piece of wood at a time. A year after the sentencing, I drove to Arlington National Cemetery. The endless rows of white headstones stood in silent, perfect formation under a clear autumn sky. I found my father's grave, its simple inscription bearing his name, rank, and the years of his service. There was no mention of his wealth or his social standing, only his duty. I knelt and ran my hand over the cool, smooth stone. I didn't say anything out loud. I didn't need to. I just stayed there for a long time, the quiet grief finally unburdened by the weight of anger and injustice. I had fulfilled my last mission for him. I had protected his name. As I stood to leave, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet understanding that his real legacy wasn't in a will or a bank account, but in the silent code of honor he had passed on to me. Before I left the city, I made one last stop. I drove to the impound lot, where my father's 1967 Mustang had been taken after being seized as a federal asset. It was just sitting there, covered in a thin layer of dust, a forgotten relic of a life that no longer existed. It was going to be sold at a government auction, its value just another number added to the forfeited assets. I stood there for a moment, looking at the car he had taught me to drive in, the car filled with so many memories, and I felt nothing. No sense of loss, no desire to get it back. It was just a thing, a beautiful, expensive object that had become tangled in their web of greed. I had the memories, and that was enough. I turned and walked away without looking back, leaving the last ghost of my old life behind for good. Today, my life is simple. I have a small apartment over the workshop, a rescue dog that sleeps at the foot of my bed, and the quiet satisfaction of a hard day's work. I don't have the McLean mansion or a portfolio of stocks. I don't have a luxury car or a famous last name. Most days, I'm just James, the guy who makes furniture down the street. But when I look in the mirror, I see my father's son. I see a man who has nothing, yet has everything that truly matters. They tried to erase me, to buy my silence and bury my father's honor under a mountain of lies and stolen money, but they failed. Because a true inheritance isn't something you're given, it's something you carry inside you, and that is something no one can ever take away. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-confidence, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. Looking back on it all, I realized the most profound lesson I learned wasn't about money or justice. It was about the true meaning of inheritance. We're taught to think of a legacy in terms of what's left to us: houses, stocks, a family name. But my father taught me, in his own silent way, That a real inheritance is what's left inside of us. It's the principles we carry, the integrity we defend, and the quiet strength we find when everything else is stripped away. The fortune my mother and sister fought for was just paper and property. It was a hollow prize. The legacy my father gave me was a compass, one that pointed toward honor even in the darkest of rooms. And that's something that can never be seized, forged, or sold at auction. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any other kind, because it comes from the very people who are supposed to be your safe harbor. For a long time, I was drowning in the injustice of it all. But what I came to understand is that their actions, their greed, and their cruelty were never really about me. It was about their own emptiness, their own fears. They tried to define me as a failure to justify their own moral bankruptcy. The lesson here isn't to hold on to that anger, but to recognize that you are not defined by how others treat you. You are defined by how you respond. Their attempt to break me was the very thing that forced me to build a foundation of my own, one that wasn't based on their approval or their name, but on my own two hands. I also learned the immense power of quiet. In a world that rewards the loudest voice, the most dramatic gesture, I was seen as weak because I was silent. My mother and sister mistook my grief for surrender and my patience for apathy. But my silence wasn't empty. It was strategic. It was where I listened, where I observed, and where I found the clarity to act when the time was right. True strength isn't about shouting down your opponents. It's about having the discipline to wait for the perfect moment, to let others reveal their own weaknesses, and to make your one move count for everything. It's a different kind of power, one that doesn't need an audience to be effective. And what about wealth? I lost a fortune, the kind of money that most people only dream of, but I've never felt richer. I learned that true wealth isn't measured by the balance in your bank account, but by the peace in your heart. It's the feeling of earning your own way, of knowing that everything you have is a result of your own effort and integrity. It's the freedom from the constant fear and paranoia that comes with a life built on lies. They were prisoners in a mansion, chained to a criminal enterprise, while I found liberation in a simple workshop. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to discover what's truly valuable, what's truly yours to keep. This journey was never about revenge. If I had been driven by a desire to see them suffer, I would have become just as empty as they were. My mission was about vindication, not for myself but for my father. It was about restoring the truth. That's a crucial difference. When you fight for a principle larger than yourself, you find a purpose that anger alone can never provide. The goal wasn't to tear them down. It was to lift up my father's honor from the mud they had dragged it through. Justice, in its purest form, isn't about punishment. It's about balance. It's about making things right. And in the end, that's all I did. I simply put things back in their rightful place. Ultimately, this whole ordeal forced me to answer the hardest question a person can face. Who are you when you have nothing? When the family name is gone, the money is gone, the home is gone, what's left? For me, what was left was my father's son, not the heir to his fortune, but the heir to his character. I had to be stripped bare to finally see it, to finally claim it as my own. And that's a journey I think everyone, in their own way, has to take. You have to separate who you are from what you have. And in that space, you find an unbreakable sense of self. You find the person you were always meant to be. So, if you're facing your own battle, feeling invisible or undervalued by the people who should see you most clearly, remember this: your worth is not up for negotiation. It's not something that can be written out of a will or silenced by insults. It is forged in the quiet moments when you choose integrity over ease and truth over comfort. Your real legacy is being built right now, in every choice you make. It's the story you write with your own actions, and no one can ever take that away from you.